When your avoidant ex starts reaching out again, it can feel like everything you've been secretly hoping for is finally happening. You see their name light up on your phone and your heart skips a beat. For a moment, you're transported back to the early days of the relationship when things were good, before the distance crept in, before the confusion, the emotional coldness, the withdrawal, and in that moment, it's tempting to believe that their return means they've finally realized what they lost, that they've changed, that they're ready to show up fully this time. But here's where you need to be careful. When someone with avoidant tendencies starts chasing again, it doesn't automatically mean they've transformed into a secure, emotionally available partner. It might just mean they're feeling a temporary loss of control, a moment of vulnerability, or a hit to their ego. Avoidant people often operate in cycles, pulling away when things get too close and then returning when they feel safe again. It's not necessarily a sign of commitment. It could be a reflexive reaction to the space you created when you finally stopped reaching out or trying to fix things. This is the moment where you have to pause and ask yourself what's really happening here. Because if you jump straight back in emotionally, if you let the fantasy of the relationship cloud your judgment, you risk re-entering the same painful loop that left you feeling unseen and emotionally starved. Just because someone is chasing doesn't mean they're prepared to catch you with open arms and a steady heart. They might just miss the validation, the comfort of knowing you're still there, or the sense of control they had when they knew you'd always respond. The mistake many people make is interpreting pursuit as proof of readiness. That because they've come back, it must mean they're now capable of the kind of love you always wanted from them. But real readiness doesn't show up in a late-night message, a random phone call, or a vague "I miss you." It shows up in consistency, in actions that match words, in an ability to stay present even when things get emotionally intimate or challenging. You have to be honest with yourself about what you actually experienced in the relationship. Not the highlights, not the potential, not the version of them you hoped they'd become, but the reality, the emotional availability, the communication patterns, the way you felt in the quiet moments when no one was pretending. That's what you have to measure against, not the butterflies that show up when an old flame reappears. Because the truth is, avoidants can be incredibly magnetic when they want to be. They know how to draw you in without ever fully showing up. They know how to give just enough to keep hope alive while still maintaining their emotional distance. So when they reappear, it's not always a grand sign of transformation. Sometimes it's just a continuation of the same cycle, this time dressed in the clothes of temporary desire or regret. You need to approach their return from a place of clarity, not longing. That means recognizing the pattern for what it is. Is this behavior new, sustained? Is there evidence that they've reflected, grown, and are willing to engage with you in a different way than before? Or are they simply reacting to the loss of your attention, mistaking the discomfort of absence for genuine love? It's also important to ask, are you responding to them, or are you responding to the version of the relationship that lived in your head? The version where they were finally capable of meeting your emotional needs. The version where the connection felt safe and reciprocal. The version where you didn't feel like you had to earn their affection or prove your worth. Because if you're still holding on to that fantasy, then it's not really them you're missing. It's the hope of what you always wanted them to be. What they're offering now needs to be assessed with fresh eyes. You're not who you were at the beginning of that relationship. You've likely done some inner work, spent time healing, built your confidence, and learned to value yourself in ways you didn't before. That growth matters, and it should inform how you receive them, not with blind hope, but with discernment. Not with open arms, but with open eyes. So when your avoidant ex shows signs of chasing, don't just listen to their words, watch their patterns. Look beyond the moment and examine the history. Does their current behavior represent a break from the old cycle, or is it simply another lap around the same emotional merry-go-round? Because recognizing the pattern means protecting the growth you've earned. And if you can see it clearly, you can finally stop reacting from a place of old emotion and start responding from the strength you've built since. When your avoidant ex starts chasing again, one of the most important things you can do is slow everything down. Not because you're playing games, not to manipulate them, but because reclaiming your power means reclaiming your pace. In the past, the relationship likely operated on their terms. They pulled away, you chased. They needed space, you gave reassurance. They went quiet, you filled the silence. And now that they're reaching out again, there's a part of you that might feel a rush, a sense of urgency, like you have to respond quickly, act decisively, or else you'll lose the moment. But this is where you need to shift the dynamic entirely, because speed favors the avoidant. They thrive when you're acting from impulse, from fear, from the hope of reconciliation. Your job now is to move with intention. Avoidant partners often become more interested the moment you withdraw your energy. It's not always conscious manipulation. Sometimes it's simply that your absence triggers something in them. Maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's ego, maybe it's the discomfort of not having you as their emotional safety net anymore. So when they start showing signs of pursuit, it's often because your distance disrupted the rhythm they were used to. You're no longer supplying the attention, the affection, the reassurance. And that shift creates a vacuum they instinctively want to fill, not necessarily because they're ready to invest, but because they're trying to restore a sense of control. So now that they're showing signs of wanting to re-engage, the power dynamic has changed. You're not the one chasing anymore. They are. But that doesn't mean you automatically open the door. Instead, you respond by slowing the tempo. You don't have to ignore them and you don't have to punish them. You just have to meet them with the energy of someone who is no longer reactive. Because when you slow the pace, you start to see things more clearly. You give yourself time to observe, not just their words, but their follow-through. You create space to notice whether their attention is fleeting or sustained, whether it's a real attempt at connection or just a reflexive reach for comfort. When you don't rush to reply to every message, when you don't immediately agree to meet up, when you don't dive into long conversations about the past, you send a message that you are no longer emotionally available on demand. You show that you have standards now, that your time and energy are valuable, and that access to you is something that has to be earned. This is not about being cold or aloof. It's about being measured, intentional, grounded, because the old version of you might have been willing to accept breadcrumbs, to interpret minimal effort as a sign of care. But the version of you now understands that real connection requires real consistency. Slowing the tempo also gives them a chance to feel what it's like to work for your attention. Not in a punishing way, but in a healthy, balanced way. Because someone who truly wants to be in your life will stay the course. They won't disappear the moment you stop making it easy for them. They won't give up when they see that you're no longer emotionally wide open. They'll lean in. They'll adjust. They'll prove through action that their intent goes beyond a moment of curiosity or regret. There's also something powerful that happens inside you when you slow down. You begin to reclaim your emotional space. You give yourself room to process what's actually going on, instead of just reacting to a feeling. You ask better questions. You become less focused on what they're doing and more focused on what you need. And when you do that, you start to see the difference between someone who misses the idea of you and someone who's truly ready to show up for the real you. The one who's grown, the one who's healed, the one who now knows her worth. You're not in the same place anymore, and that means you don't have to follow the same patterns. You're allowed to take your time. You're allowed to respond at your own pace. You're allowed to move slowly, even when their messages seem urgent. That urgency doesn't have to become your urgency. Their desire to reconnect doesn't require you to abandon your center, because real love doesn't rush. It doesn't demand immediate answers. It respects your timing. It waits. It proves itself. And if what they're offering is real, it will still be there after you've taken the time you need to assess it with clear eyes and a steady heart. When your avoidant ex starts to come back around, your instinct might be to explain to them how much you've changed, to tell them all about the growth you've done, the boundaries you've built, the way you've learned to honor yourself. You might want to spell it out in detail to make sure they understand you're not the same person who once accepted the bare minimum or bent over backwards just to keep the connection alive. But the truth is, the most powerful transformation you can show them isn't in your words. It's in your energy, in your actions, in the way you now carry yourself in the interaction. People who are avoidant often test waters indirectly. They don't always come back with grand declarations or a full apology. Sometimes they just drop a casual message, a friendly emoji, or a vague reference to a memory from your past. They're looking to see if you'll respond the way you used to, if you'll give them the same access, the same emotional availability, the same eagerness. That's where your evolution needs to speak louder than any explanation. Not with a long text about how much you've grown, but with a simple shift in how you show up. Less urgency, less effort to keep the connection going, more clarity, more control over your own energy. You don't need to prove anything, you just need to live differently. If they message you at midnight and the old you would have replied instantly, now you pause. Maybe you wait until the morning. Maybe you ask yourself if you even want to engage. If they suggest hanging out with no real plan, and the old you would have jumped at the chance just to be near them, now you consider whether that offer even meets your standards, whether it aligns with the respect and consistency you now require. Your response time, your tone, your boundaries, all of it becomes a reflection of who you've become. There's a quiet strength in letting your behavior do the talking. When you don't fall into the same emotional rhythm, when you don't overfunction to make them feel comfortable, they feel it. They notice the difference. They realize that the power dynamic has shifted, that you're no longer playing the role they remember. And that shift in energy can be more impactful than anything you could try to explain. The best part of showing your growth through your presence is that it doesn't rely on their response. It's not dependent on them recognizing it or validating it. It's something you carry for yourself, a kind of inner authority that says, I know who I am now. I know what I want. I'm not afraid to walk away again if this doesn't align. That kind of energy doesn't chase. It doesn't beg. It doesn't shrink to fit the comfort of someone else. It just is. That's what makes it so magnetic. Not because you're trying to impress them, but because you're finally prioritizing your own peace over their approval. You're not explaining why you've changed. You're living it. You're letting the way you handle the situation speak for itself. The way you take space. The way you protect your time. The way you ask questions instead of offering explanations. All of these things communicate a new level of self-respect, and that's something they can feel, even if they don't have the words to articulate it. When your avoidant ex starts to show up again, even in small ways, it can stir up a storm of emotions. A late-night message, a random like on social media, a vague text asking how you've been, it doesn't seem like much, but when it comes from someone who used to be distant and emotionally unavailable, it can feel like a lifeline, like maybe this is the beginning of something different. Maybe they've realized your worth, maybe they finally miss you. And that kind of hope can be intoxicating, but this is exactly where you need to get real with yourself. Because if all they're giving you are crumbs and you're offering them a full meal in return, then nothing has actually changed. You've just gone back to feeding a pattern that once left you emotionally hungry. Avoidants are often masters of minimal effort, not necessarily out of malice, but because they've learned to keep emotional distance. They like to stay in control. They tend to keep one foot in and one foot out. And when they reach out again, it's often in small, ambiguous ways. It's rarely direct or clear. It's never a full commitment. Instead, they send signals just strong enough to keep you engaged, but weak enough to avoid true vulnerability. And if you're not paying attention, you'll respond to those crumbs with your whole heart, your full presence, and the kind of emotional investment that should only be reserved for someone who is actually showing up for you. The dynamic becomes unbalanced all over again. They offer you a casual check-in and you respond with emotional availability. They give you a tiny window of attention and you open the entire door. And once they feel reassured that you're still emotionally accessible, the urgency that brought them back begins to fade. Because for many avoidants, it's not about deep connection. It's about knowing you're still there, that they haven't lost you completely, that they can still access your care, your validation, your emotional labor when they need it. This is why your response in these moments is so crucial, because every time you overgive in response to under-effort, you teach them that they don't have to try harder. You show them that a little effort is enough to get a lot from you. And that dynamic not only drains you, it also enables their avoidance. It allows them to stay emotionally uncommitted while still reaping the benefits of your presence. That's not love. That's maintenance, that's comfort disguised as connection. And if you're not careful, you'll end up back in a situation where your needs are sidelined and your worth is tied to someone else's inconsistency. So what do you do when the breadcrumbs start? You match their energy. If they're offering casual, you don't respond with deep. If they're being vague, you don't fill in the blanks for them. If they're dipping a toe in, you don't dive head first. You let them feel the natural consequence of doing less, getting less. That doesn't mean being rude or shutting down. It means holding a standard. It means not rewarding low investment with high availability. It means recognizing that real interest looks like effort, like clarity, like consistency, not half-hearted check-ins or flirtatious nostalgia. When you stop feeding the dynamic with your overgiving, something powerful happens. You start to preserve your energy. You stop feeling drained and confused. You create space for someone to either step up or step aside. You give yourself the dignity of waiting for real connection instead of accepting scraps that stir up old hopes. Because the truth is, the more you respond to crumbs, the more you reinforce the idea that that's all you believe you're worth. And whether consciously or not, the other person picks up on that. They learn how little they have to do to keep you emotionally tethered, and they act accordingly. Your self-worth shows in how you respond to inconsistency. When you hold back your full energy and instead observe their behavior, you shift the power dynamic. You stop playing the role of the pursuer. You stop filling the gaps. You start responding like someone who knows they are the prize. That kind of response doesn't chase, doesn't overextend, doesn't over-explain. It lets the other person experience the impact of their own level of effort. And that's the only way anything can truly shift. Not by you doing more, but by you doing less, and watching who's willing to do more in return. There's a moment when your avoidant ex starts to circle back and everything inside you lights up with anticipation. You wonder what they're thinking, what they're feeling, whether this is the sign you've been waiting for. You analyze every word, every pause, every emoji, hoping to find a clue that they finally get it, that they finally see your value. But this is where you need to hold on to something much deeper than curiosity or nostalgia. You need to hold on to your center. Because the greatest test in these moments isn't whether they come back. It's whether you stay anchored in your self-worth, no matter how they show up. Avoidant partners often return not out of clarity, but out of confusion. Not because they've done the deep work, but because they're responding to a loss of control, a wave of loneliness, or an unfamiliar silence from someone who used to be emotionally available to them. And it's tempting to take that return as a sign of transformation. But what matters more than their reappearance is your emotional posture when they do. Are you grounded? Are you still clear on what you want? Are you prepared to hold your standards even in the presence of someone who once had the power to unbalance you? Self-worth doesn't get louder when an old flame returns. It gets quieter, more rooted. It doesn't need to shout, perform, or prove. It simply holds. That means not rushing to please, not shrinking your boundaries just to keep the conversation going, and not compromising your emotional needs just to keep the connection alive. The old version of you may have made excuses, justified mixed signals, or accepted less than you deserved out of fear that setting a boundary would push them away. But now, self-worth becomes your compass. It guides your responses, your expectations, and your pace. When they text, you don't automatically light up with hope. You assess. You listen to the energy behind the words. You notice whether they're asking about you or just talking about themselves. Whether they're showing interest in rebuilding trust or just dropping in for attention. You don't ignore your gut anymore. You don't minimize red flags, because now you're operating from a place where your peace is more important than potential, where your standards don't lower just because someone from your past shows up with a little more effort than they did before. You start to recognize that your worth isn't validated by their return, it's revealed by your response. How you hold yourself in these moments speaks volumes about the work you've done. You no longer feel the need to fill in the silence, to keep the connection going at all costs, or to rescue them from their discomfort. You're not here to be their emotional caretaker. You're here to be met. And if they can't meet you where you are with clarity, intention, and respect, you no longer feel the need to shrink yourself just to bridge the distance. One of the most powerful things you can do is maintain your standards without apology. You don't need to be harsh or cold. You can be warm and open while still being discerning. You can be kind without being permissive. You can respond without reattaching. Because now you're not emotionally invested in their potential. You're invested in your reality. You want partnership, not a puzzle. You want emotional safety, not sporadic sparks. You want something that lasts, not something that disappears the moment it gets too real. If they're truly serious, your standards won't scare them off. They'll call them forward. The right person won't need you to soften your boundaries to feel close. They'll respect the space you've created. They'll want to understand what matters to you. They'll listen without defensiveness. They'll act in alignment with their words. They won't just chase. You won't have to be caught. You'll both walk toward each other with clarity. That's what self-worth attracts. Not intensity, but mutuality. Not drama, but devotion. So when your avoidant ex reappears, your job isn't to manage their feelings or decode their intentions. Your job is to stay rooted, to check in with your values, to remember how far you've come since the breakup and how much peace you've cultivated since the distance. You're not the person who once needed closure to feel okay. You're not waiting to be chosen. You're already enough, already whole. That energy doesn't chase after old stories. It writes new ones, with or without them.